Did you know that Bertrand Russell wanted to kill himself? Famed philosopher and mathematician. Struggled quite a bit during his early life. Let me read you what he wrote. I was not born happy. As a child, my favorite hymn was "Weary of earth and laden with my sin." At the age of 5, I reflected that if I should live to be 70, I had only endured so far a 14th part of my whole life, and I felt the long spread out boredom ahead of me to be almost unendurable. In adolescence, I hated life and was continually on the verge of suicide, from which, however, I was restrained by my desire to know more mathematics. Now, on the contrary, I enjoy life. I might almost say that with every year that passes, I enjoy it more. This is due partly to having discovered what were the things that I most desired and having gradually acquired many of these things. Partly it is due to having successfully dismissed certain objects of desire, such as the acquisition of indubitable knowledge about something or other, as essentially unattainable. But very largely it is due to a diminishing preoccupation with myself. Like others who had a Puritan education, I had the habit of meditating on my sins, follies, and shortcomings. I seemed to myself, no doubt justly, a miserable specimen. Gradually, I learned to be indifferent to myself and my deficiencies. I came to center my attention increasingly upon external objects, the state of the world, various branches of knowledge, individuals for whom I felt affection. All right, so quite a journey that Russell went on, and so much so that he wrote a book about happiness, which is perhaps not as well known as his philosophical and mathematical works, but nonetheless there are some interesting things to pay attention to here. And in particular, we're going to focus on some comments Russell makes about, in essence, hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. And I think he has a really interesting way of framing it. So let me quote the passage and then we can discuss. A man may feel so completely thwarted that he seeks no form of satisfaction, but only distraction and oblivion. He then becomes a devotee of pleasure. That is to say, he seeks to make life bearable by becoming less alive. Drunkenness, for example, is temporary suicide. The happiness that it brings is merely negative, a momentary cessation of unhappiness. The narcissist and the megalomaniac believe that happiness is possible, though they may adopt mistaken means of achieving it. But the man who seeks intoxication, in whatever form, has given up hope except in oblivion. In his case, the first thing to be done is to persuade him that happiness is desirable. Men who are unhappy, like men who sleep badly, are always proud of the fact. Perhaps their pride is like that of the fox who had lost his tail. If so, the way to cure it is to point out to them how they can grow a new tail. Very few men, I believe, will deliberately choose unhappiness if they see a way of being happy. Okay, so lots to say about this. First of all, just this framing, this oxymoronical label that Russell applies to this phenomenon, temporary suicide. There's just so much in those two words put together. And there's an accuracy to it, though, despite its oxymoronical nature, that when we do indulge, we do make a decision to intoxicate ourselves, that arguably for a moment at least, we do cease to exist, at least in our prior form. We have rejected our individualism in a way and are in this strange limbo where we're not who we were formerly, but we're not quite dead either. Now, certainly some will say, depending on the particular substance or vice in question, that this is not always the case. Russell uses the example of alcohol, and no doubt there are many people that they don't see it that way, that they believe that alcohol is a complement to their life. It perhaps eases their anxiety or allows them to be more charismatic, talkative, and it's therefore an addition versus a subtraction or a cessation or a negation of their individuality. And perhaps you can make that case, but once the habit develops or reaches a certain threshold, that becomes harder to entertain that idea that it's merely a complement. Now, with those more severe cases, Russell claims that people have sort of convinced themselves that this is the only way to be. This is the only way to be happy. This commitment, this being a devotee of pleasure, as he puts it. That oblivion is their only sort of respite from their regular existence. And his suggestion, therefore, is you must persuade the person, convince them that no, there is an alternative available to them. Now, the tricky thing with a dependence or someone that becomes dependent on a particular substance, whether it's alcohol or anything else, is that it's rarely planned. It's rarely something that is aimed at from the start, and it tends to be quite an incremental process. It takes time to escalate to a point where it now becomes this very entrenched habit that is hard to break and that now feels like a necessity to function. And then to take it away there's a perception that I'm going to create a lot of suffering for myself by doing that, so why do that? Even though, as Russell stated, that really at some point all you're doing is staving off future misery via the continuation of the habit. So, to go back to this idea of it being an incremental process, so yeah, most people, they don't become dependent on something overnight. Many people that, as I described earlier, may have viewed it as a complement to their life can go on believing that for some time without many noticeable downsides. But then there's a point whereby they've crossed into this other realm. And now it's not necessarily something that they can just sort of snap their fingers and decide to go back to that former way of being. So it is quite a pernicious trajectory and can sort of feel like quicksand to some. Now, the explanations for why some people are prone to this escalation beyond a reasonable consumption, however we define that, if at all. Some may argue that there's no amount that is healthy or worth doing. But assuming there is, for those that go down this very extreme route, why is that the case? Well, there's certainly several hypotheses that have been put forth, and I think it's pretty well established now that if you've gone through some significant trauma or family issues growing up, neglect, physical, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, etc., that the drug use or the alcohol, whatever it may be, can be an adaptation to that unprocessed trauma. So that seems like a pretty consistent and legitimate explanation. It may not apply in all cases, but it's certainly somewhere that we would look first to just rule that out, because it is so common. And you can look at the work done by the researchers involved in the ACE study. Many people have talked about this, like Gabor Mate, etc. And early adverse events and how they impact people's habits and their health outcomes later in life. It's a pretty consistent and arguably dose-dependent effect. So again, it may not apply in all cases, but it's one of the first places to look. Now, for the individual though, it's hard to make any particular suggestions without knowing your individual context. You got to do that self-reflection yourself, or in a therapeutic context if that's what you opt to do. But I think we can leave it there for now. Again, I just really enjoyed the way Russell described this phenomenon, and it's worth perhaps reflecting on if there is a substance in your life that perhaps you had considered a complement, an addition, but it begs the question, is it a symptom of a restlessness or a discomfort or dissatisfaction with your sober state? Is there something about that, whether you're alone or with other people, that you don't feel quite right, and that you feel the need to ingest something, an external, to function within that environment? Why is that the case? And if you could enjoy or function in those environments without it, would you not want to do that? And if your answer is yes, well then the question is the substance moving you closer to that or further away? Or is it a potential barrier to achieving that goal? Okay, so let's leave it there, and we'll talk next time. Thanks.